Hello, everybody. My name's Paul Deis. I'm a model railroader. I've been model railroading my entire life. My earliest childhood memory is of my dad's Lionel that he set up in the basement bedroom I shared with my brothers. He set it up every year for Christmas. He usually set it up in October, and then sometimes he took it down the following August. But pretty much, I've had trains in my life forever. Since then, I've modeled in 027, then N scale, HO on a modular level, and then HO home layouts for a while in 1 to 20. I also have built a 7.5-inch gauge train that I run at a friend's, and I volunteer on a 2-foot gauge railroad. So I've been doing this for about, I guess 55 or so years. What I'd like to do today is help you understand what's involved in building a model railroad. Not that you would do it exactly the same way I would do it or use exactly the same techniques, but the idea is, how do I go from sitting in my recliner thinking about the railroad I want to build someday and wondering, how do I really get it to the point where people go, ooh, that's pretty cool looking. And, it doesn't matter whether you're modeling like Jack Burgess, who has modeled an instant in time on the Yosemite Valley in 1939, where you can look at a picture of the real world and look at his layout, and they're exactly the same. Or if you're striving to be a John Allen, who had a completely fictional railroad that was just amazing. Unfortunately, I only see pictures of it, or someplace in between. But the idea is, if you know what it is that you have to do, you can get out of that recliner and get started. So we're going to look at one scene on my current HO layout. My HO layout depicts the Southern Pacific Railroad on the Central Coast in 1949, and I model from San Luis Obispo to San Miguel, California in 49. I pick a specific date or a specific year. It helps me save money. That way, when some new beautiful freight car comes out, if it couldn't have been on the Central Coast in 1949, I don't need it. And then once I got my layout going, I was able to sell about half the freight cars I already had, because again, they weren't correct for my era on my location. So let's get started. We start with design. The first thing you have to do is figure out, what do I want to model? For me, once I decided what I wanted, I could then do research on what the prototype looked like. I could find track plans. I could take pictures of the area, knowing that however I modeled it, if I didn't get it exactly right, there's very few people that would know. So I really looked I want to model the flavor of the Southern Pacific in 1949 on the Central Coast. There are some buildings that still exist that were back in that day, and some of those key buildings I'm putting on my layout, and I will actually try to scratch build those to look just like the building did in 49. But the rest is just to capture the flavor. So my first thing to do was to design the layout. So here's the scene we're going to look at. It's at the east end of the town of Santa Margarita. Santa Margarita was a really busy place in the earlier days of the railroad. The Southern Pacific had to use helpers to get from San Luis Obispo up over Cuesta Grade. And Santa Margarita is where they took the helpers off and turned them on a Y, and then took them back down took the next train back over the grade in the opposite direction. So it was a pretty busy railroad town. It had a lot of industries on very little trackage. Another reason I really like it is I modeled my railroad for the purpose of having operating sessions. So I wanted to make sure that there was enough work to do, but without a bunch of puzzles for track work, so that my operators could have fun. And by following the prototype, I could look at how they laid out the track. So here in the drawing, which is to scale, I showed the main track work coming through, where the main structures are, roadways, whether they're asphalt or dirt roads, and the outlines of the different structures I was going to place. I also have the signal locations. I don't have all the little tiny structures, but it's the main structures, because I'm going to need to know that as I go forward in building. The next step is bench work. There's a lot of ways to build bench work. What myself and what we call my Thursday night boomers, which is a group of guys have been getting together for almost 30 years, working on each other's layouts, came up with an idea of using steel bench works. So we don't really have any legs, or on my layout, 2 legs in the entire layout that touch the floor. Everything else is suspended from the walls. In this case, we're using 1-inch square tubing welded to a piece of flat plate, which is then lag bolted to the studs in the room. On top of that, in yard areas or town areas, I'm using 1/2-inch quality plywood. In between towns, I use masonite splines. It's important that however you decide to do your bench work, you understand that everything else for the rest of the time you have that layout will be based on how well your bench work is. If your bench work is sloppy, you're never going to get your track to work right. If your bench work is weak, you'll wind up with problems with your track or your structures. So you got to build your bench work. Even though it's never going to be seen again, you got to build it solid. So this is the way we chose to do it. There's lots of other ways. There's L-girder, there's just plywood, there's tabletops. Whatever it is you do, just make sure it's not going to go bad on you. After the bench work was in, I like HomaBed or HomaSote road bed. HomaBed was a product that was sold by a company that's actually changed hands several times. I think the last one was California Roadbed. It's where they've taken HomaSote product, which is a insulating soundboard used in construction, and they've milled it for you to the shape of very similar to cork roadbed. One of the reasons I really like the HomaBed is I hand laid all my track, and it works really well for holding spikes. But use whatever you're going to use, but now's the time to put it down. Here, the HomaBed has been put down with white glue and held in place with metal tacks while the glue dries. After the HomaBed's down, I give it a very light sanding to get any irregularities out of the material. As I said, I hand lay my track, but I didn't want to spend my whole life doing it, although it seems like I did. The reason I hand lay my track is because I really enjoy it. People will tell you it's cheaper or it's whatever. You know what? It's fun for me to do. It may not be fun for you to do. My last layout, I hand laid all my turnouts, but all the rest of the track was flex track. Many layouts ago, I used snap track. Whatever it is you decide to use, you really got to do it correctly and smoothly so that your trains will operate. Here, I buy my ties in bulk. They come in 24-inch long lengths. Spend many hours, one of me or one of my friends, sitting at the table with a chopper, cutting tens of thousands of ties. And then I made this little jig where I can lay the ties in the jig and then cover them with a piece of masking tape and lift them off as a unit to put them into place. Here I'm getting ready to lay one of the other towns, and I've got a bunch of strips of the ties pre-made. With a thin masking tape, I find as I lay them, I can turn them and get smooth arcs on curves. Here you can see the ties laid in place for the town of East End of Santa Margarita. And you see the paper where the turnouts are. If I'm doing a turnout that is in a standard configuration, a number 6, number 8, left, right, whatever, I found online a couple of different places, including the Fast Track's website, where you can download turnout templates. I'll glue that template on a thin piece of paper right onto the HomaSote, and that way I can get my ties correctly lined up. I've also, in those bin boxes, you can see I've cut all the different lengths of ties I need for my switches. So as I work, I've got the ties all in usually 1 foot lengths to match the templates. If I'm building a turnout in place other than a standard number of 4, 5, or 6, or 8, instead of having the paper template, I'll lay a piece of flex track down and take a marker and slide it down the edge of the ties. Then I'll take that same piece of flex track and curve it to where the other half of the turnout's going. And again, take a marker and tab all the ends of every tie, and that gives me a drawing of where the ends of the ties are, and then I can hand lay my ties in place. I glue the ties down again with white glue, and then after they've in place and they've dried for a couple of days, I come back with a long piece of wood, about a foot long, with a piece of sandpaper on it, and very lightly hit the tops of the ties to make sure that they've all wound up at the same height. I then come through and stain all my ties. I like the tried and true method of some alcohol and India ink. Exact formula, I don't know. I throw some India ink in the alcohol and I mix it up. And the next time it might be a little different, which is okay because you want your ties to be looking a little bit different. And even though the ties all came out of the same package, they're all the same basswood, they do absorb that alcohol at slightly different rates, which gives you, again, an irregularity in the color of your ties. As I said, I like to hand lay my track. Again, I do it because I like it. I also do it because when I'm building turnouts, I can build the turnout to fit the location instead of designing my layout to match the turnouts. I use a nice little tool called rolly gauges to hold my rails in place. They make them for different thicknesses or different heights of rail. Here I'm laying on code 83 rail. And the rolly gauges keep your rail in gauge as you spike it. And you can just slide them back and forth as you go to whichever part of the railroad you're doing. I usually use about 10 gauges at a time so I can keep a fairly long section of rail properly engaged. When I first started laying turnouts by hand, I used turnout kits from BK Enterprises. I was afraid to figure out how to make frogs. Frogs was the scary part for me to get them quite right. I did a number of turnouts that way, and then I found that Fast Tracks makes filing tools. I don't use their jigs because, again, I build my turnouts in place, but they make these really nice tools for getting your points filed correctly and also for filing your point rails and your frogs and for filing the side of the rail where the points are going to nest in against it. So I use those Fast Track jigs, really, really handy to use. And if you're going to be doing hand laid turnouts, the first thing you buy is new files. You need a nice, sharp file. It'll really reduce the amount of time. Also at the center, you see a piece of wood with some blue lines on it. That's how I mark the separation of how many ties I spike to. It's about every fifth or sixth tie gets 4 spikes. Again, I do it because I enjoyed it. I suggest you try it. I found that after a stressful day at work, I could come home after dinner, grab a glass of wine, and sit down and build a few turnouts or lay, 10 or 15 feet of track. Again, your enjoyment on your railroad is really going to depend on how well your track work is done. Whatever kind you use, just make sure all the joints are smooth, the track is level from side to side, your transitions are smooth. The smoother you do your track work, the more fun you're going to have later running trains without any derailments. For putting feeders, guess what? We got to get electricity to the rail. I like my feeders to disappear once the railroad is laid. So I take bell wire. I do things cheaply. Bell wire is red and white twisted number 22 wire that is sold in rolls of 500 feet. It's meant for doorbells. It's a nice small wire. I bend the end over and crush it flat so it kind of resembles a spike head. Then when I pull it down next to the rail and solder it in place, then when I come back later and weather my rail and put the ballast in, it basically disappears. If you find with plastic track or otherwise you're melting ties, believe it or not, you don't have a soldering iron that's hot enough. The amount of time I have to apply heat to that joint, if I use a clean piece of rail, put some rosin core, flux core rosin, not acid core rosin, on the rail, some really thin solder. I come at it with a really hot iron. It takes less than a second to get the rail and the wire hot enough to put solder. If you have a blob of solder, you're not doing it right. Basically, the solder should almost disappear between the wire and the rail. When you do your wiring, have a plan, have a color code, have your way of doing wiring. I really don't like solder connections in my wiring. I'm an old marine electrician, and I just have been taught, and over the years, solid wire between terminal points. I use a lot of terminal strips. I label things. I use a standard color of wire. That way, when 6 months or 6 years later, I have a wiring issue, or I got a short that I couldn't figure out, or a turnout motor, I can look up at my wiring and know exactly what wires are going where, so that I can break gaps in the wiring to troubleshoot a short. It also just makes it look neater. Costs a little more money, costs a little more time. I'm never laying on my back looking up at solder dripping on my face, which is a handy part. So have a plan for your wiring. You then have to cut gaps. Years ago, I would use insulated rail joiners. They just didn't look good. They didn't hold the rail nice and aligned. I cut my gaps after all the track is down, it's soldered, it's wired. I cut it after I'm done with all the soldering, because soldering heats the rail, which causes it to expand. If you've already got gaps, they're going to get messed up. So the soldering is done. I come in with the Dremel tool. I cut a thin gap in the rail, and then I glue in a styrene tombstone, or a little piece of styrene material with ACC. And after it dries, I come back with an X-Acto knife and I carve it to the same shape basically as the rail. When I come back and paint my rail later and ballast, they absolutely disappear. But they'll give you a positive electrical gap. You still need to think about some places in your railroad, depending on the climate control of your train room, of whether or not you need expansion gaps. If you have a non-climate controlled train room and have big swings in temperature, the rail really likes to move. People will say, oh, the homosote swelled or the wood moved. If you actually talk to somebody who knows the science of materials, what moves more than anything else is nickel silver rail as it expands and contracts. The next part of my way of building a layout is to get my fascia up. I used 1/4-inch masonite. I like 1/4-inch masonite. It's inexpensive. It's easy to cut on the table saw. It'll bend pretty tight without cracking, and it gives you a really nice smooth finish. Also, you find that as you build your layout, your benchwork becomes more stable as you add the fascia. It helps to stabilize everything. It also gives you a place for turnout controls. It gives you a place for instructions for crews. It gives you a place to hang boxes for car cards. It's just really handy to do, and it's inexpensive. And when you paint it, it looks really nice. Here's an example where I've used vinyl lettering that I have on a machine that cuts vinyl, where I've laid out the pattern for the track going into my staging yard. I later went back and drilled holes and added toggle switches to control those turnouts. Now it was time to run some trains. As I said, I do operating sessions. That's what I built the railroad for. So I operated for about a year before I did any scenery work. The reason I did that is I wanted to, one, make sure my track work was good, and to make sure that I didn't need to add a turnout someplace or change the length of a siding to make the operations more fun. Again, I didn't want to have any crazy puzzles. There are some of the switching operations that aren't just simple, but that's the way the real railroad had them. The railroad doesn't like to spend money on extra track work or extra switches. So I ran it for about a year. And during that year, I did find a couple of places where I needed to do some minor adjustments to the track, and a couple of places I added crossovers to make it easier for my operators. So make sure your track is bulletproof before you start your scenery. Time to start the scenery. I started with some more of my 1/4 inch masonite. Like I said, I really like this stuff. So I used the 1/4 inch masonite to put up a backdrop, to give some general curves to the background, to give some place to later do my scenery from my background. So it's 1/4 inch masonite screwed to a variety of different methods of holding it, whether it be an upright piece of wood or screwed actually through the drywall into the regular wall. And my wiring is hidden behind it. So after the masonite goes up, I start out with good old drywall mud. I use drywall mud a lot for a lot of things, but here I'm actually using it almost what it's designed for. I use some tape and drywall mud and start to smooth out all of the seams and gaps in that backdrop. This is also when I start to really lay out where it's going to be sitting in my scenery. So I either take the plans for a structure kit that I'm going to build, and if the plans have a actual footprint, and I'll make a copy of those plans, or if I'm scratch building, or if the kit doesn't have a good footprint plan, I will draw it out to scale on a piece of paper, and I actually start taping those in place on the layout to confirm where the buildings are going to go. This is also when I'll take a marker and mark out where my roads are going to go. It's going to become important when we start to do the scenery of putting the correct scenery in the correct place. And also have a truck there just to mock up where I'm going to put my parking lot next to my milling building. Campbell kits are really neat because they have plans that come with the kit that give you the footprint. And in this case, I was building the Campbell stockyard, but I modified it. I changed the layout of the stockyard. I changed where the loading ramp was for the trucks to make it better fit my railroad and my roadways and what I wanted. Plus, if I have an opportunity to change a building a little bit, that way when you come over my house, it's not the same stockyard you built. Here also, I've put in homosoap pads for where my signals are going to go and homosoap pads where my turnout stands are going to go. And those funny little holes in the front is I like sound on my railroad. I like a lot of sound, but not loud, very soft, subtle sound. Well, at all my stockyards, I have the ability to play the sounds of stock cars being loaded. One, it gives the operators a chance to slow down. They'll spot a car at the stockyard, push a button on the fascia. It plays about a 60-second loop of the sound of a stock car being loaded. Then they spot the next car and do it again. It slows down the operations and just gives a little more flavor to the railroad. So here I've now put a coat of primer on my backdrop. Still have all my little structure pieces marked out. Now I've painted my sky blue color. Well, what blue do you use? What I did is I took my camera outside and took some pictures of the sky on a day that I thought looked kind of typical. Then I went to the paint store with those pictures and compared it to the paint chips, grabbed a variety of paint chips that looked close, brought them home, and put them in place in my current and planned layout lighting. It's amazing how much color will change between the actual sky outside, your fluorescent lights you might have in your room for working, and the lighting you're actually going to use on the layout. So I played around with the colors till I found the blue I liked under my layout. And that's what I use to paint my backdrops. So sky blue on all the backdrops. Then I start to define the forms of the ground. The method I like to use is I take cardboard strips, I weave them in place, I glue them down with some hot glue. It's easy to then start to visualize what the ground's going to look like. It's easy to change. I can tear a piece off, glue a new piece down. And also where I'm going to have a paved road, I'll put down a piece of that thin cardboard to actually lay out the road. Here I've got some hillsides that I'm going to be putting in, so I've used the lattice work of the cardboard stripping. Remember, everything in the layout is pretty much done as layers. And here we got a layer of the cardboard strips on top of the plywood. On top of the cardboard, we'll add a few more layers before we get to final scenery shape. So just remember, it's going to be a little more than you see right now. I like to use plaster impregnated cloth. You can buy it in little rolls put out by several of the model companies, or I buy it in a 20-pound box that is made actually for either artistic use, or they used to use it for making casts. It's really nice. You can cut it with a pair of scissors, you dip it in water, you can take your hands and smooth it in place. If you build up 2 layers, you get quite a bit of strength. If you notice, I've got now red lines all over the railroad. That's where I've now lifted off my paper outlines of my structures and marked them with red marker, so that I make sure I bring my shape of my terrain down to the edge of where I want to put a building later. So this is 2 layers of that plaster cloth. It really gives you some definition to the shape of what you're doing, but it's not the final shape. So you don't have to worry about it. Got little ridges here, little nooks and crannies, because the next layer is going to remove a lot of that. Now I take my structures and put them in place. Make sure that the shapes of the terrain I have will work for the structures I'm planning on planting in those locations. Now's a good time to make changes if you need to. For example, that water tower in the center of the picture, I wound up not using. But right up to the last minute, I was going to have that water tower there. That water tower, by the way, came off of a friend's layout who passed away, Jim Vale. A number of structures on my railroad are from Jim Vale's layout, and kind of a memorial to Jim. If you knew Jim, you know why it's important to have some pieces of Jim's layout. Okay, I've removed the structure. Now I go to my next layer. Back in probably the 70s, a model railroad put out a formula for stuff called ground goop. It's a mixture of equal parts of permacene, which is a vermiculite type material, sculptamold, latex paint, and white glue. Sculptamold, permacene you can't get anymore. There was a rumor it had asbestos in it, and they wound up going out of business later to be proven it doesn't have asbestos in it. But if you get vermiculite at the hardware store, at the nursery center, it works the same. Sculptamold is easily available either through a hobby shop or through an art supply. I get the latex paint. I look for goof paint. Goof paint is paint that they mixed at the paint store and the customer didn't want it. So I look for goof paint that looks reasonably like dirt. Usually at the paint store, if they don't have one exactly right, they'll throw a little tint in it for you. And white glue. I buy white glue by the gallon bottle. I use it for a lot of things on the railroad. So here you mix that together to like the consistency of pancake batter. It takes a little while for the lumps to break down from the Sculptamold. And then I use a couple of spatulas and gloved hands and just smear it all over. You get to smooth out some contours, you get to do some shaping, and the end result is you got dirt. Looks like dirt. It takes a long time for it to dry, usually a day. If you're in a real humid environment, suggest you add a little bit of pine salt, just a quarter teaspoon to your mix. That way, as it dries, you won't have any mold grow in it. I learned that the hard way where I used to live on the coast. Where I live now in Paso Robles, doesn't happen. This stuff is dry rather quickly, but it gives you some time to work it. We'll further define the shape of the ground when we get to the next layer, which will be the ground cover. My next step I did is I started on my backdrop. So I went through with some more of that blue paint and touched up where I got the plaster or the goop on the backdrop. And I started painting my sky. I used a system that I got back in 1996 at the Long Beach Convention, put out by a guy named Miles Hale. Miles is a pretty famous clinician for doing lots of things, but he did a program called The Sky's the Limit on how to paint backdrops. And he still sells really nice stencils for doing your backdrops. So that's the beginning of my clouds. In front of the clouds, use a deep blue, again using his stencils to give the shape of distant mountains. And in between every layer, you mist the backdrop with some white paint, and it causes each layer to fade further and further back. Then I use a forest green for hills that are a little bit closer, And you can see now where the blue has got some of that white misting over the top of it. Then I went with brown for the next layer. So that's the hills that are close up. And then the final layer, I used a tan because the area I'm modeling and the time of year I'm modeling is a lot of dead grass, which is that California gold that you may have heard about. So that's my next layer, is that tan. Then I come back in and brush paint with a green paint, and I just stipple on distant trees and distant brush. And that's it. That's my backdrops. Now we put the structures back in again to test placement, because our next step, we're going to start putting down our ground cover, our grasses, bushes, trees, and we want to make sure that things are where we really want them to be. Also, at this time, I confirm where my roadways are and parking lots. Now I come in with some more of that drywall mud. The reason I like drywall mud is it stays good for a long time in a container. It's easy to work with. It's very forgiving. It's slow drying. And when it's all done, you can come back and put another layer on to smooth it out, especially because it does crack. The first layer will crack. You can also hit it real lightly with sandpaper to smooth out any bumps. And it also takes colors and stains real well. Here I've put some cardboard in as the base for my grade crossing and brought the drywall mud up next to it. I then paint my roadways, the asphalt roadways, with charcoal acrylic paint. That's the inexpensive little bottles of paint you get at Michael's or other art supply stores. I like the charcoal. It looks like a used road. And again, it's got some texture to it, and the drywall mud has texture, which will come up later when we start to weather the road. Now I've covered all my rail and road bed with blue tape, and I start using a mixture of ground foam for my colors of my terrain. Again, I'm modeling the time of year when that brown grasses, dead grass throughout the whole part of California, is now starting to be replaced by new green grass starting to grow up. I really do this randomly. I keep my jars of my ground foam in line. I start with dirt and earth and dark green and light green and then yellow on top. And it gives me the color I like. You need to look at the time of year and location where you're going to model. I grew up in New Jersey. In New Jersey, this would be the winter time with the yellow, unlike the summertime here in California. Some of that ground foam, I just throw it all over. It wound up on the roadway. I didn't have any glue on the roadway. So after everything had dried, I came back and brushed the ground foam off the roadway, and it left behind enough of it that it made the road look used. By the way, what I use to hold all my ground foam down is I use a 50-50 mixture of water and white glue with a drop of dish soap. I bring my ground foam right up to the side of the roadbed, because you think about, in reality, when they ballast, the ballast comes down on top of the terrain. If weeds are up in your ballast, that's a railroad that's not well maintained. And the railroad really doesn't want anything in their ballast. I test fit my structures again. And this is where I'll say, okay, I want a path here. I want a little footpath. I want a patch of weeds. Where am I going to put my trees so that they either block the part of the structure I want or they're not in the way of the structures? Now I clean everything up and start putting some ballast down. I also paint my rail at that time. When I do ballasting, I like to, again, guess what? I use white glue diluted with water, and I paint the sides of my roadbed first and sprinkle the ballast on, let it dry, brush any excess up onto the roadbed in between the ties. Now I fill in my ballast between the rails, get it all smoothed out. Now, unlike painting the glue on first, I get my ballast in place between the rails. I mist it with rubbing alcohol in a spray bottle, and then using a dropper, I put in the white glue and water and a little drop of soap mixture and let it dry. And here I've also built some wooden crossings. This is a rural road back in 1949. It's not a main thoroughfare, so it's just wood planks in place for the crossing. Now it's Arbor Day. It's time to plant trees. Again, I'm modeling California. The part of California I model is mostly oak trees, California type oaks, not back east oaks. So these are coastal oaks, they're live oaks. They're real gnarly looking trees. That tree in the center, I wish I had 500 of them. They were made by a guy, they're called Okie Dokie Oaks, by another modeler named Charlie Piquet, who unfortunately passed away a number of years back. Luckily, I had bought about a dozen of them from him to know I would use them someday. And then Jim Vale had them all over his layout. So I was fortunate to be able to buy from his daughter a number of his Okie Dokie Oaks. They're just absolutely beautiful trees. I've tried to make them and have failed. So I use my Okie Dokie Oaks, and then I surround them with trees that I have found that I purchased online. I like JT brand oak trees. They're the only ones that make a reasonable store-bought oak. I don't only model oaks, it's just mostly oaks. I also mix in a few other varieties of trees that would be found in this part of California. I like to have a variety of trees that are different heights, slightly different foliage colors. It just makes it look more varied and more realistic. I've also now weathered my ties with a variety of washes to make them look a little older. Just some good old acrylic paint diluted with water and dribbled into different places, just randomly throwing the different colors down, because that's the way Mother Nature would have made it for us. Also try to add a little bit of debris around the trees. There's not a lot in this picture, but that's something I try to come back and do. You know, dead branches, little pieces of brush. Now is also when I actually plant my structures. That's a term Jim Vale used to use. Jim wrote a column in every issue of Narrow Gauge and Shortline Gazette until he passed. And he used that term, planting my structures. If you look in real life, a structure does not sit on top of the dirt. It's down into the dirt. And here's where I'll also start adding my details. So there's a little brush climbing up the side of that outhouse. There's a man climbing the back steps into the farmhouse. There's a trash can at the side of the farmhouse. Little details, just little things that when your friends are over, your guests are over, they may not notice everything every time they come. But another day they go, oh, when did you put that in? Well, it's been here all along. You just never noticed it. This is where you can look at different colors and such in your terrain. The more details, the better. So here I've added a couple of line side structures, an SP phone booth, a box for the circuitry that controls the signals. I've added some signals, some switch stands. I've added lighting to my stockyard. The more little details you can throw in, the more variety you give to the layout, the more fun there is to the layout. I really like adding lighting. It's a whole variety of companies out there that sell really nice types of lighting in LEDs, real easy to do. Again, it just had a little variety. There's a guy sitting on the fence on the corral. I try to vary my textures and my colors. So in the foreground is that asphalt road. Behind the lumberyard building is a dirt road. There's stacks of lumber in the lumberyard. There's different bits of debris around the railroad. The more variety you can add, the better. That structure in the very back, you can see some lighting. I took that structure and put some false walls inside and painted them black and put an LED light inside and put a little bit of the cargo that would be in that building. It adds a little bit more fun to the scene. Here's a worker loading a truck. I weathered the truck with some light dustings of Bragdon's powders and added some lumber. The weathering should match the era that you're trying to model. I model 1949. If you're modeling in the middle of the Depression or the middle of World War II, buildings were getting kind of rough because people didn't have money to put into upkeep on their buildings. So this building's got some weathering, but it's not too bad because it's 1949. It's after the war. Things are starting to get better. People are starting to buy new products. People are able to go fix buildings. I even had figured on my layout, I'm going to have a couple of buildings that still have some blackout paint on the glass that hasn't been removed. You can set your field, you set your mode for your railroad by thinking about what would have been there at the time that you're modeling. More details, I simple crossbucks on a rural road back in that time. In my county, the only automated crossings they had back then was a wigwag in the town of San Luis Obispo. The country road doesn't have any painted lines, where if it's a line in a street in town, it may have some painted lines. Again, a variety of ground cover, a variety of trees. The more you can give a scene on your layout, the more interesting it is, the more fun it is. You can always add more detail. I do plan on coming back someday and add some maybe old ties and some tie plates and some old rail and dirt and add some litter around the railroad. But right now, I'm happy with the way this scene looks. Thinks it looks quite nice for the time I'm modeling, and I've got a whole lot more railroad to weather and a whole lot more scenery to build. I hope you got some ideas about what it takes to get from the idea sitting in your recliner to actually having a railroad that people come to your house and go, whoa, that's pretty cool. And then operate a railroad you can operate. You know, this is fun. Model railroading is fun. I'm glad that you are here to listen to me. And if you have questions or comments or ideas on how to do something different, we are going to have a discussion session after this clinic. I hope you have a great day and enjoy the convention. Thank you.